The origins of the Third Reich's shadow economy can be traced to the financial instability that followed Germany's defeat in the First World War and the conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Between 1919 and 1933, the German economy underwent repeated cycles of inflation, foreign dependence, and state intervention. Reparations payments to Allied powers, coupled with limited access to global credit, led to the creation of complex networks of unofficial trade and hidden capital transfers designed to bypass international restrictions. These practices, first developed by industrial and financial elites during the Weimar Republic, laid the foundation for the covert economic mechanisms that would later sustain the Nazi regime. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was still recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment exceeded 6 million, and industrial output had fallen by more than 40% compared to pre-crisis levels. The Nazi government's economic program, directed by Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and later Minister of Economics, aimed to achieve two goals simultaneously: reduce unemployment through public works and prepare for large-scale rearmament in secret. The dual nature of this program required both official and unofficial economies. Publicly, the regime invested in infrastructure projects such as the Autobahn network and state housing programs, financed through deficit spending and domestic credit expansion. Privately, it constructed hidden systems of financial exchange, barter trade, and capital manipulation that would allow Germany to rearm without violating the Versailles restrictions or provoking foreign intervention. The cornerstone of this shadow system was the MIFO bill, a financial instrument created in 1934 by Schacht and industrialist Gustav Krupp. MIFO bills were promissory notes issued by a fictitious company, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, and guaranteed by the state. They allowed the government to pay armaments firms without immediately recording the expenditures in the official budget. Between 1934 and 1938, over 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of MIFO bills circulated, concealing the true scale of rearmament. Industrial corporations such as Krupp, Siemens, and Rheinmetall benefited from guaranteed contracts, while the state maintained the appearance of financial stability. The Wehrmacht's rapid expansion, from 100,000 men in 1933 to over 800,000 by 1938, was financed largely through these covert credits. At the same time, the Nazi regime created networks of barter trade and bilateral agreements to bypass foreign exchange shortages. The Reichsmark was not fully convertible, and Germany lacked sufficient reserves of gold or hard currency to import raw materials. To overcome this limitation, Schacht negotiated trade deals with countries in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Balkans, exchanging industrial goods for raw materials through clearing accounts. This system, known as bilateralismus, allowed Germany to conserve foreign exchange while securing vital imports such as oil, rubber, and iron ore. However, it also created dependency relationships, as smaller economies became tied to the German market through credit-based trade. Beyond formal economic measures, an informal network of intermediaries, front companies, and secret funds began to form around Nazi institutions. The SS and the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, DAF, established their own economic branches, acquiring control over industries, real estate, and forced labor programs. These activities, though nominally separate from the state's official budget, were closely integrated into the war economy's structure. Profits from confiscated assets, particularly those seized from political opponents and Jewish citizens, were redirected into private and institutional accounts. By 1938, following the Aryanization of Jewish businesses, tens of thousands of enterprises had been transferred to regime affiliates at reduced prices, creating a new economic elite loyal to the party. The Nazi government's manipulation of economic data further concealed the emergence of this shadow economy. Official statistics emphasized full employment and industrial growth, but inflation was suppressed through wage controls, rationing, and the prohibition of labor mobility. The Reichsarbeitsdienst, labor service, and rearmament industries absorbed millions of workers, masking real shortages in consumer production. A parallel system of controlled scarcity and state-issued substitutes Ersatzstoffe, emerged to maintain the illusion of economic stability. While living standards stagnated, propaganda framed the sacrifices as national duty, transforming economic hardship into an ideological virtue. By the eve of the Second World War, the Third Reich's economy had become a layered structure, an official public system governed by ministries and statistics, and a hidden network of industrial cartels, secret credits, and coercive labor. The shadow economy was not a byproduct, but a deliberate instrument of policy. It allowed Hitler's regime to prepare for war under the guise of recovery and national renewal, concealing the vast militarization of resources that would soon dominate Europe's industrial landscape. The mechanisms developed during these years, financial opacity, forced integration, and ideological control, would later define not only the wartime economy, but the economic exploitation of occupied Europe itself. When war began in September 1939, the economic structures built in secrecy during the 1930s were transformed into a vast machinery of controlled exploitation. The official wartime economy operated under the supervision of the Ministry of Economics and the Four-Year Plan Office, led by Hermann Göring, but beneath this bureaucratic surface lay an informal network of industrial conglomerates, SS enterprises, and occupied territory administrators, whose interests often diverged from official policy. The war did not create the shadow economy, it expanded it. Every new conquest added territories, resources, and populations that could be absorbed into Germany's informal economic empire, often beyond oversight of the Reich's financial institutions. At the outbreak of war, Germany's foreign exchange reserves were nearly exhausted. The Reichsmark was already losing its value outside Germany, and the cost of mobilization threatened to destabilize the entire economic system. The solution was to externalize the burden. The Third Reich's planners, drawing from experiences during the rearmament years, constructed a model of economic occupation in which conquered territories financed their own exploitation. Through a combination of forced levies, exchange rate manipulation, and confiscation of state assets, Germany extracted capital and goods without formal annexation. In Poland, for example, the German authorities introduced a distorted exchange rate, 2 zlotys for 1 Reichsmark, allowing them to buy Polish goods at half price. A similar system was applied in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where occupation costs were imposed on local governments. France alone paid approximately 750 million Reichsmarks per month in occupation expenses, effectively transferring its national income to Berlin. This flow of capital created a second, unofficial budget for the Reich. Funds collected from occupied territories bypassed normal accounting channels and were used to sustain the war effort, pay industrial contracts, and expand SS operations. The Reich main treasury recorded these revenues as special accounts, giving Göring, Himmler, and other high officials access to unregulated resources. The arrangement also enabled corruption on an unprecedented scale. Gauleiters, military governors, and industrial managers competed for control of confiscated goods, factories, and bank accounts. Precious metals, art collections, and agricultural products were routinely diverted into private or institutional possession. This network of appropriation blurred the boundary between state policy and individual enrichment. The SS emerged as a central actor in this informal system. Under Himmler's direction, it expanded its economic activities through the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, Economic and Administrative Main Office. This institution managed a portfolio of enterprises that included armaments production, construction, agriculture, and mining. The most notorious among these were the Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke and the DEST Brickworks, which relied heavily on concentration camp labor. Prisoners were leased to private companies such as IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens for a fixed daily rate, paid directly to the SS. By 1943, more than 500,000 forced laborers were employed under these arrangements, generating profits that were reinvested into SS-controlled projects, including the construction of camps and military facilities. Parallel to these activities, the Wehrmacht developed its own networks of economic control in occupied territories. Military administrators oversaw requisitioning, transportation, and exploitation of resources for logistical purposes. However, Competition with civilian ministries and SS agencies often led to inefficiency and duplication. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine and Belarus, the Wehrmacht supply services clashed with SS and Reich Commissariat officials over access to grain and oil. Each organization maintained separate accounting systems, leading to the proliferation of black market transactions, falsified reports, and informal exchanges of goods for political favor. The complexity of these overlapping jurisdictions made central regulation impossible, allowing the shadow economy to flourish. Financial institutions also participated in the expansion of this hidden system. The Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and Reichsbank facilitated the transfer and laundering of confiscated assets, including gold and foreign currency looted from occupied central banks. Transported through Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, these funds were used to purchase strategic materials that Germany could not otherwise obtain. Neutral intermediaries, such as the Bank for International Settlements, played a subtle role in maintaining channels for these transactions, often without full knowledge of their origins. The result was a global web of concealed economic activity linking occupied Europe, neutral states, and German industry. For ordinary Germans, the wartime economy presented a contradictory picture. Official propaganda continued to emphasize order and self-sufficiency, but beneath the surface, scarcity and rationing had created fertile ground for domestic black markets. Cigarettes, coffee, alcohol, and clothing became secondary currencies. Industrial managers and party officials often traded favors, access to rationed goods, or foreign luxuries as part of informal exchange networks. The line between corruption and necessity blurred as survival itself became a form of economic participation. By 1941, as Germany's conquests reached their peak, the Third Reich's shadow economy had become a state within the state. It operated through an intricate hierarchy of ministries, private corporations, and SS institutions, all competing for profits under the veneer of central planning. The official economy maintained the illusion of stability through controlled statistics, but real power lay in unrecorded transactions, forced labor, and appropriation. This parallel structure sustained the war effort in the short term, while ensuring that the economic order of the Reich rested on coercion, secrecy, and exploitation rather than genuine productivity or sustainability. The structure of the Third Reich's wartime economy by 1941 was a complex hybrid of centralized planning and decentralized profiteering sustained through deception, forced labor, and hidden transactions. Officially, Hermann Göring's 4-year plan office directed all industrial and agricultural production, coordinating with the Ministry of Economics and the Wehrmacht's armaments office. In practice, however, no single institution exercised full control. The Nazi regime encouraged competition among its agencies, Hitler's method of governance known as divide and rule, and this fragmentation allowed shadow networks to flourish. Ministries, industrial conglomerates, and SS enterprises operated with overlapping authority, creating multiple, often conflicting, centers of economic power. The core of this shadow economy lay in its ability to conceal the true costs of war. Germany's formal budget, strained by rearmament and occupation, could not reflect the scale of expenditures required to maintain a continental war machine. To mask deficits, officials relied on off-book mechanisms, seized assets, occupation levies, and the exploitation of labor from conquered territories. Each ministry and organization developed its own channels for these resources. The Ministry of Food and Agriculture requisitioned grain from Eastern Europe. The Ministry of Transport controlled rail freight and fuel allocation, while the SS turned concentration camps into industrial production centers. None of these flows appeared in official Reich financial reports, yet they formed the economic backbone of Nazi power. A crucial component was the institutionalized plunder of occupied economies. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the Wehrmacht and German civil authorities systematically drained local industries. Raw materials were requisitioned under the pretext of wartime contribution, and factories were compelled to supply the Reich at fixed prices. The Reichswerke Hermann Göring conglomerate, established in 1937, expanded into occupied territories, seizing ironworks in Lorraine, Poland, and Austria. It became one of Europe's largest industrial empires, employing over 600,000 workers by 1943. Meanwhile, the armaments giant G. Farben acquired chemical plants and refineries in Poland and France, while also managing the Buna synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz, constructed using slave labor from the adjacent concentration camp. The integration of forced labor into this system was both economic necessity and ideological principle. By mid-1942, Germany faced acute labor shortages as millions of men served in the Wehrmacht. The solution was the large-scale deportation of civilians from occupied territories. Fritz Sauckel, appointed General Plenipotentiary for Labor Deployment, coordinated the recruitment and transfer of foreign workers. By 1944, more than 7.5 million foreign laborers were employed within the Reich, constituting nearly 1/4 of its total workforce. Many were civilians brought from France, Poland, and the Soviet Union. Others were prisoners of war or concentration camp inmates. Though nominally paid, their wages were withheld or confiscated, funneled into SS and state-controlled accounts. The exploitation of these workers sustained industrial output while keeping official payroll and cost figures artificially low. Within Germany, this hidden labor economy intersected with the regime's propaganda narrative of self-sufficiency. The concept of Wehrwirtschaft, a defensive economy, framed total mobilization as a moral obligation. Citizens were told that rationing and sacrifice were forms of national contribution, while foreign labor absorbed the burden of production. This ideological justification masked the extent to which the German population benefited from forced labor. Consumer goods, food, and housing were increasingly produced or maintained by non-German workers, yet the official discourse erased their presence. The SS's control over labor camps also allowed it to accumulate enormous independent wealth. By 1943, SS-run enterprises managed more than 150 subsidiaries, producing construction materials, textiles, and armaments. Their profits, deposited into special accounts at the Reichsbank, financed further expansion of the camp system and private ventures under Himmler's patronage. The concentration of economic power within the SS's bureaucracy paralleled the growing fragmentation of state institutions. Göring's four-year plan, initially conceived as a mechanism of central coordination, devolved into a competing empire within the regime. Göring himself oversaw vast monopolies in mining, metallurgy, and synthetic fuel production, but increasingly relied on confiscated assets and foreign exchange manipulation to sustain them. The Ministry of Armaments, under Fritz Todt and later Albert Speer, added another layer of control. Speer's reforms in 1942-43 focused on rationalization and increased output, produced short-term efficiency gains. Yet these gains were achieved by tightening the exploitation of slave labor and expanding underground industries, literally hidden economies operating beneath the ruins of bombed cities. Financing this system required continuous deception. The Reichsbank and Finance Ministry maintained the facade of solvency by issuing war bonds and printing money, while foreign assets looted from occupied central banks provided temporary liquidity. Gold taken from national reserves in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia was melted down and stored in Berlin or transferred through Swiss intermediaries. The SS contributed its own inflows. Gold teeth, jewelry, and valuables taken from victims in extermination camps were processed by the Reichsbank and reintroduced into circulation. These materials appeared in no public balance sheets, but their cumulative value reached hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. While the official narrative emphasized unity and national purpose, the economy was in reality increasingly driven by competition among factions. Each power bloc, industrialists, military planners, SS officials, and civilian administrators, sought to expand its control over resources. The result was an environment of overlapping corruption and ambition. Industrialists profited from state contracts and forced labor, while cultivating relationships with SS and party officials. High-ranking officers secured privileges through black market exchanges of fuel, food, and luxury goods. Civil servants manipulated ration cards and production quotas for personal gain. The longer the war continued, the more the lines blurred between organized state exploitation and private enrichment. By 1943, the cumulative effect of this internal fragmentation had created two parallel economies. The first, visible and bureaucratic, produced official statistics, propaganda, and budget reports. The second, invisible yet dominant, consisted of confiscations, secret accounts, and coercive labor systems. Together, they formed the true war economy of the Third Reich, one that operated through deception, exploitation, and constant improvisation. The Nazi leadership understood that its survival depended not on fiscal balance or economic sustainability, but on perpetual expansion. As long as new territories and victims could be incorporated, the system could mask its deficits. But when territorial conquest ceased and military defeats mounted, the entire structure of the shadow economy began to reveal its fragility. Its dependence on theft and coercion meant that once the flow of plunder stopped, the economic engine of the Reich would begin to collapse from within. After 1942, the economic structure of the Third Reich began to show deep fractures beneath the illusion of total control. The outward expansion of conquest had reached its limits, and with it, the primary mechanism that sustained the Reich's hidden economy, systematic plunder, started to diminish. Yet the regime continued to rely on the same shadow mechanisms that had fueled its rise: forced labor, confiscation, black markets, and unregulated trade between power factions. As defeat loomed, these instruments became tools of survival rather than domination, reflecting the disintegration of a state that had built its wealth on coercion and deception. Albert Speer's appointment as Minister of Armaments in February 1942 marked an effort to bring order to the chaos of overlapping economic authorities. Speer implemented a program of rationalization that consolidated production under a centralized structure known as the Rüstungsstab, armament staff. By standardizing weapon designs, concentrating industrial output, and introducing production quotas, Speer managed to increase output despite mounting resource shortages. However, his efficiency depended entirely on the exploitation of forced labor and the absorption of resources from occupied territories. By 1943, German arms production had risen by over 60% compared to 1941, even as raw material imports declined. The apparent success concealed the reality that this productivity was achieved through human exhaustion, secret requisitions, and an economy running on moral and material depletion. As the tide of war turned against Germany, the black and gray markets within the Reich expanded rapidly. Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, creating chronic shortages of fuel, food, and consumer goods. Rationing became stricter, but enforcement weakened. Civilian populations, factory managers, and military officers resorted to barter, smuggling, and bribery to maintain access to essentials. Cigarettes, alcohol, and jewelry functioned as informal currencies. The SS and Wehrmacht officers stationed in occupied territories funneled luxury goods, foreign currency, and stolen art back into Germany, fueling a thriving underground economy that extended from Berlin to Vienna. Officially condemned as unpatriotic, this trade was tolerated because it sustained morale and lubricated the functioning of the war machine. The SS's economic empire reached its zenith during this period. Through its Economic and Administrative Main Office, WVHA, it managed an extensive network of industries linked to concentration and labor camps. Companies such as G. Farben, Krupp, and Messerschmitt operated plants adjacent to camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, paying fixed rates to the SS for prisoner labor. These arrangements blurred distinctions between state, private, and criminal enterprise. The SS reinvested its profits in construction projects, property acquisition, and armament ventures, effectively operating as a private conglomerate within the state. By late 1943, Himmler's enterprises controlled more than 500,000 prisoners and 200 industrial facilities. None of these operations appeared in official Reich accounts, yet they represented a significant share of its war production capacity. In occupied Europe, the process of economic extraction reached its most destructive phase. German administrators stripped territories of labor, food, and machinery. In the Soviet Union, the Reichskommissariat, Ostland, and Ukraine requisitioned agricultural products on a massive scale, leading to famine and population collapse. Between 1941 and 1944, over 11 million tons of grain and 3 million head of livestock were shipped westward. In France and Belgium, factories continued to produce goods for the Reich, but growing resistance and Allied bombing forced production underground, creating black markets that rivaled the official occupation economy. In some cases, German officials themselves facilitated smuggling networks to bypass bureaucratic bottlenecks or to secure personal profit. These activities underscored how the Nazi economy, initially driven by ideology, had by 1944 become sustained primarily through corruption and improvisation. Within the Reich itself, the collapse of transparency was total. Financial ministries no longer attempted to maintain balanced budgets. Currency inflation was suppressed through propaganda and repression rather than policy. The Reichsbank printed unbacked currency, while confiscated gold and foreign exchange were used to stabilize short-term trade with neutral states. Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain served as conduits for these shadow transactions. German front companies traded industrial diamonds, tungsten, and oil through intermediaries, concealing their origins. Officially, Germany remained a command economy. In practice, it resembled a cartelized network of criminal enterprises operating under the cover of total war. Speer's rationalization policies, often celebrated after the war for their technical success, masked the moral bankruptcy of the system. The apparent rise in productivity after 1943 was achieved by doubling the exploitation of slave laborers and transferring industries underground or into occupied territories. Entire production chains were relocated into tunnels and caves to escape Allied bombing, where tens of thousands of prisoners worked in lethal conditions. Mortality rates in these subterranean factories exceeded 30%. The SS's involvement in these projects ensured that the boundary between industrial planning and systematic murder disappeared entirely. As Germany's defeats multiplied, the shadow economy turned inward. The very elites who had profited from conquest, industrial magnates, SS administrators, and party officials, began to hoard wealth in anticipation of collapse. Gold, foreign currency, and art stolen from across Europe were hidden in mines, castles, and alpine warehouses. Bank transfers to Switzerland and Liechtenstein increased sharply in 1944. At the same time, ordinary Germans, facing shortages and destruction, engaged in local black markets to survive. In the final year of the war, the German mark's real purchasing power had eroded by nearly 70%, while illegal trade accounted for almost a third of domestic economic activity. By 1944, the Third Reich's economy no longer functioned as a unified system, but as a mosaic of self-preserving institutions. Ministries, corporations, and SS offices competed for dwindling resources, often sabotaging one another in the process. The shadow economy, once an engine of expansion, had become a symptom of collapse. Every level of society, from high-ranking industrialists to factory workers, participated in networks of concealment, barter, and theft. The war economy's efficiency had been a myth. Its real foundation was coercion and chaos. As the front lines closed in, the Nazi state's financial empire began to cannibalize itself, devouring what remained of its resources in a desperate attempt to sustain a war it could no longer afford to fight. By early 1944, the mechanisms that had sustained the Third Reich's shadow economy began to consume themselves. The Reich was running out of raw materials, labor, and territory to exploit. The collapse of supply routes from occupied Europe and the intensification of Allied bombing forced every sector of the economy into a state of emergency improvisation. What had once been a calculated system of exploitation and concealment devolved into a fragmented network of local survival economies, operating under the illusion of central control. Yet, even in its disintegration, the shadow economy continued to serve the regime's core function, prolonging the war through deception and coercion. Speer's armaments ministry, still formally responsible for production, became dependent on informal channels that blurred legality. Industries circumvented rationing and fuel shortages by trading directly with SS enterprises or regional authorities. The black market became institutionalized within the state. Coal, steel, and oil were reallocated through personal negotiations rather than directives. Party officials and factory managers hoarded supplies for their own operations, falsifying production reports to meet quotas on paper. The Reich's statistics, showing steady or even rising output through 1944, were increasingly fictitious. Behind these numbers lay a disjointed industrial system sustained by slave labor, bribery, and hidden resource transfers. Forced labor remained the foundation of this system. As Allied advances cut off access to occupied territories, millions of prisoners and foreign workers were relocated to Germany. By mid-1944, more than 8 million forced laborers worked in German factories, agriculture, and construction. Many were transported from concentration camps or labor camps near the front, often in death marches that left thousands dead before arrival. These workers were assigned to munitions plants, coal mines, and aircraft factories under appalling conditions. The SS continued to lease prisoners to private companies for daily fees, paid in Reichsmarks to SS accounts. For industrialists, these arrangements offered the only way to maintain production amid collapsing manpower. For the SS, they provided one of the last reliable sources of revenue. In financial terms, the Reich's solvency was entirely artificial. The war economy functioned through a cycle of confiscation and printing money. Occupied territories, once the primary source of revenue, were now either liberated or devastated. To maintain liquidity, the Reichsbank issued vast quantities of unbacked currency, inflating the money supply, while suppressing prices through propaganda and control. In practice, inflation erupted in the form of barter and black market pricing. The nominally fixed ration system became meaningless. Basic goods traded at 10 or 20 times their official value. Cigarettes replaced money as a stable medium of exchange. Soldiers, bureaucrats, and civilians alike engaged in trade of stolen goods, food, and fuel, undermining the very moral discipline the regime claimed to uphold. The SS and party elite, sensing the approaching collapse, transformed the shadow economy into a means of personal survival. High-ranking officials transferred gold, foreign currency, and art into hidden accounts in Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain. SS officers organized clandestine shipments of looted valuables from concentration camps and occupied banks, some using Wehrmacht transport convoys to smuggle assets out of Germany. Himmler's agencies created secret funds labeled Sondervermögen, special property, which financed SS projects and personal enrichment. Meanwhile, industrial leaders, foreseeing post-war accountability, began to destroy documents and disguise financial ties to the regime. The chaos of late-war Germany provided perfect cover for these acts. Bombed cities, disintegrating bureaucracy, and collapsing communication networks made oversight impossible. As Allied forces advanced, the economy's fragmentation deepened. In Western Germany, local Gauleiters and military commanders operated autonomously, requisitioning goods and directing production without consultation with Berlin. In the East, scorched earth orders destroyed railways, factories, and storage facilities to prevent Soviet capture, further eliminating what little coherence remained. Each region became a self-contained economic zone, feeding its own survival networks through hoarded fuel, hidden food reserves, and forced labor. The Reich's total war had devolved into localized warlord economies, each functioning through corruption and coercion. Speer attempted to maintain the illusion of centralized planning until the final months. He reorganized production in bomb-proof shelters and underground facilities, moving industries beneath mountains and into tunnels. These emergency factories, including those near Mittelbau, Dora, and Ebensee, were constructed entirely by concentration camp prisoners. Mortality rates among workers reached catastrophic levels. The armaments they produced, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, and tanks, were technological achievements built upon human destruction. Yet, even as output continued, transportation collapse and fuel shortages rendered much of it useless. By late 1944, fewer than half of the weapons produced could be delivered to the front. Domestically, ordinary Germans lived within a dual economy, one regulated by the state, the other governed by necessity. While official propaganda insisted that the Reich stood united in sacrifice, everyday survival depended on access to informal trade. Farmers hid grain from state collectors, workers stole factory goods to exchange for food, and soldiers smuggled items home from the front. The Gestapo and local police, overwhelmed and underpaid, often participated in these activities themselves. The moral economy of the Reich, based on loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice, had collapsed into a system of opportunism. By the beginning of 1945, the Third Reich's economic order no longer existed in any coherent sense. Its fiscal institutions were hollow, its industries divided among competing authorities, and its currency effectively worthless. What remained was an economy of extraction and survival, operating under the facade of bureaucratic order. The same secrecy and improvisation that had fueled Germany's rise to war now defined its demise. The shadow economy, once a tool of hidden strength, had become the mirror of total collapse, a self-devouring system in which corruption, coercion, and deception were the only functioning currencies of a dying regime. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich's economic system had entered its terminal stage. The destruction of infrastructure, the loss of territories, and the collapse of administrative control reduced the once industrialized empire to a collection of disconnected economic zones, struggling to survive amid chaos. The official ministries in Berlin continued to issue decrees, but their authority had become largely symbolic. Transport networks lay in ruins, the Reichsmark had lost its value, and production was limited to scattered workshops and underground facilities. The war economy that had once sustained Hitler's expansionist ambitions now functioned only through the remnants of the shadow system: hidden assets, forced labor, and clandestine trade. The defeat on the eastern and western fronts shattered the foundations of centralized planning. The German rail system, which had been the lifeline of the war economy, was almost completely paralyzed by Allied bombing. Fuel shortages made motorized transport unreliable, and communication between ministries and regional authorities broke down. Gauleiters and SS commanders established autonomous control over their districts, organizing local production and requisitioning resources as they saw fit. In some areas, such as Bavaria and Austria, black markets became the primary mechanism of exchange, linking rural producers, soldiers, and civilians in networks of barter and bribery. The last remnants of the Reich's economic hierarchy survived only on paper. Albert Speer, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, attempted to mitigate the economic collapse through a series of last-minute interventions. In March 1945, he ordered the suspension of Hitler's Nero Decree, which demanded the destruction of all industrial and transport infrastructure to prevent Allied use. Speer's defiance, carried out quietly through local contacts and industrial managers, preserved essential facilities in western and southern Germany. However, his actions could not reverse the disintegration already underway. Production figures from early 1945 reveal that armament output had fallen by more than 70% compared to the previous year, and fuel production was virtually non-existent. Entire sectors, such as synthetic rubber and aircraft manufacturing, ceased to function. Within this collapse, the SS maintained its own operations. Concentration camps and forced labor projects continued until the final weeks of the war. Prisoners were evacuated westward in death marches to prevent their liberation, and many were still employed in underground armament sites as late as April 1945. SS economic offices attempted to transfer valuables, gold, currency, and industrial materials from camps in occupied territories into hidden reserves. Convoys carrying looted assets moved toward the Alps, where Himmler envisioned a final defensive stronghold, the so-called Alpenfestung. These shipments, though often intercepted or abandoned, demonstrated that the SS's shadow economy persisted even as the state itself disintegrated. In occupied and liberated territories, the remnants of the Reich's economic network turned into a scramble for survival. German administrators, industrialists, and military officers sought to conceal evidence of collaboration, destroy records, and secure personal fortunes. Some tried to exchange gold and currency with advancing Allied troops in exchange for protection or safe passage. Others fled with valuables, attempting to reach neutral countries such as Switzerland or Spain. In Norway, Denmark, and Austria, warehouses filled with looted goods were discovered, metals, art, and industrial supplies hidden for post-war use or private gain. This dispersal of assets marked the final phase of the Third Reich's shadow economy, a transformation from state-directed exploitation into individual survival strategies by those who had profited from the system. For the German population, daily life in 1945 revolved around improvisation. Food shortages became catastrophic as the distribution system collapsed. Urban residents traded furniture, clothing, and tools for food from rural areas. Cigarettes and alcohol replaced currency, while looted goods from bombed warehouses entered circulation. The line between criminality and necessity vanished. Women organized local barter markets and destroyed towns. Soldiers on leave smuggled military supplies to exchange for food. Even within the ruins, the shadow economy continued to function, now stripped of ideology and reduced to the basic exchange of survival. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they encountered an economy that existed largely outside official control. In many cities, factories still operated under self-management, producing goods for local consumption rather than for the war. Bank offices had ceased operations, and wages were often paid in food or barter credits. When Allied troops reached industrial centers such as Essen, Dortmund, and Stuttgart, they found warehouses filled with half-finished weapons, looted materials, and hidden stockpiles of consumer goods intended for post-war trade. These discoveries revealed how deeply the habits of concealment and informal exchange had penetrated the German economic system. By the time of Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the economic collapse was complete. The Reich's financial reserves were non-existent, the currency had no value, and millions of displaced persons, foreign workers, prisoners, and refugees, wandered across a devastated landscape. The shadow economy, which had once served the ambitions of empire, now became the only functioning remnant of the system it had undermined. Local barter, black markets, and hidden caches of goods replaced all formal structures of exchange. The economic empire that had extended across Europe only months earlier ended not with an official dissolution, but with the quiet persistence of the very informal networks that had sustained it. In the final analysis, the disintegration of the Third Reich's economy mirrored its political and moral collapse. What began as a project of national renewal through economic control and secrecy ended in fragmentation, corruption, and anarchy. The hidden economy that once allowed Germany to rearm and expand had devoured the state that created it. By the war's end, the Third Reich existed only as a shell, its industries in ruins, its currency worthless, and its people surviving through the same mechanisms of deception and exploitation that had once defined its power. In the aftermath of surrender, the material and administrative remnants of the Third Reich's economy became the object of intense scrutiny by the Allied powers. What they uncovered was not merely the collapse of a wartime economy, but the exposure of an immense system of hidden wealth, illicit trade, and institutionalized corruption. The Allies expected to find centralized archives and precise financial records. Instead, they encountered a web of overlapping accounts, missing documents, and concealed assets that had been distributed across Europe. The so-called shadow economy of the Reich, which had operated beneath official structures for over a decade, left behind no coherent ledger, only traces of transactions conducted through secrecy, coercion, and plunder. The Allied Control Council faced the enormous challenge of stabilizing a territory where all legitimate economic mechanisms had disintegrated. Factories stood idle, transport networks were destroyed, and millions of displaced persons required food and shelter. Yet amid this devastation, black markets thrived almost immediately. In the ruins of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, cigarettes and canned food became currencies more stable than the Reichsmark. Former soldiers, foreign laborers, and civilians bartered whatever they possessed, uniforms, tools, or looted goods for essentials. This informal trade system filled the vacuum left by the absent state. In many respects, it was a continuation of the wartime shadow economy, now stripped of ideology, but still governed by scarcity and necessity. The Allies moved quickly to dismantle the structures that had supported the Nazi economic machine. Major corporations such as E.A.G. Farben, Krupp, and Siemens were investigated for their use of forced labor and for profits derived from SS contracts. The discovery of documentation from the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, WVHA, revealed the extent of state-sponsored exploitation, tens of thousands of accounts tied to concentration camps, with profits recorded under coded entries and funneled through the Reichsbank. Despite efforts to trace and confiscate these assets, much of the wealth had already been moved abroad before the war's end. Swiss, Swedish, and Spanish intermediaries had laundered gold and currency taken from occupied territories, disguising their origin through front companies and exchange networks. The Allied effort to recover stolen assets evolved into one of the largest economic investigations in history. Teams from the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union examined seized archives, interrogated industrialists, and tracked gold movements through the Bank for International Settlements and Swiss banks. Between 1945 and 1948, the Tripartite Gold Commission identified more than 580 tons of looted gold held in neutral countries. Yet this represented only a fraction of what had been taken. Much remained untraceable, hidden in private vaults, small banks, or physically buried in the Alpine regions. The SS and Nazi officials who had overseen these transfers often disappeared, taking with them the knowledge of secret accounts and storage locations. For the German population, the first years after the war were defined by survival through informal economies. The Allied occupation zones implemented rationing systems, but distribution was slow and uneven. In cities reduced to rubble, families exchanged heirlooms or furniture for food from rural areas. Former Wehrmacht soldiers traded weapons or military equipment to farmers in exchange for potatoes and milk. Markets such as the Schwarzmarkt in Berlin became centers of daily commerce, with goods ranging from American rations to looted jewelry. The occupation authorities alternately tolerated and attempted to suppress this trade, recognizing that without it, urban life would collapse entirely. At the same time, the process of denazification extended into the economic sphere. Industrial magnates and financiers who had collaborated with the regime were arrested and tried in subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. However, the complexity of the Reich's hidden financial structures made accountability uneven. Many business leaders argued that their participation in forced labor programs had been coerced or necessary for survival under a totalitarian regime. In the emerging context of the Cold War, the priorities of the occupying powers shifted. Economic reconstruction began to outweigh retribution. The dismantling of Nazi-era companies slowed, and many former executives resumed managerial roles under new corporate identities by the late 1940s. The Soviet occupation zone, which later became East Germany, took a different approach. Soviet authorities systematically seized industrial equipment, raw materials, and financial reserves as reparations. Factories in Saxony, Thuringia, and Brandenburg were dismantled and transported to the USSR, removing nearly 30% of the region's industrial capacity. While this fulfilled short-term political objectives, it deepened economic fragmentation and poverty. In the Western zones, meanwhile, the U.S. and British administrations prioritized restoring production. Programs such as the Marshall Plan, introduced in 1948, sought to rebuild a functioning market economy, stabilize the currency, and suppress black markets through the introduction of the Deutsche Mark. Despite reconstruction efforts, the habits of concealment and informal exchange that had sustained the wartime economy persisted for years. Smuggling networks flourished along the new occupation borders, especially between the Soviet and Western zones. Black market trading remained a crucial source of income for families until the early 1950s. The Allied discovery of hidden art collections, gold caches, and counterfeit currency operations revealed that the legacy of the Nazi shadow economy extended far beyond 1945. Its techniques, financial secrecy, exploitation of labor, and manipulation of exchange systems had become deeply embedded in the social fabric. The exposure of these mechanisms forced historians and economists to confront an uncomfortable reality. The economic strength of the Third Reich had been an illusion built upon fraud and coercion. The industrial output that once impressed foreign observers had depended on unrecorded labor, stolen materials, and the liquidation of entire populations. The post-war investigations transformed this understanding into a foundational lesson of modern economic ethics. That apparent prosperity achieved through exploitation conceals not efficiency, but systemic decay. The shadow economy that had sustained the Nazi state outlived its creators, leaving behind a fractured nation and a warning about the moral cost of economic secrecy. The years following the collapse of the Third Reich revealed how deeply the structures of the shadow economy had penetrated post-war Europe. The recovery of hidden assets, the reconstruction of industry, and the restoration of normal commerce occurred against the backdrop of an economic culture shaped by a decade of secrecy, coercion, and informal exchange. The Nazi regime had dissolved, but many of its economic mechanisms, clandestine trade, off-the-record production, and the blurred lines between legality and necessity, continued to influence both West and East Germany. The black market that had once ensured survival under dictatorship now became a bridge into the post-war economy, linking the ruins of total war to the foundations of the new German states. In the Western occupation zones, the introduction of the Deutsche Mark in June 1948 marked a turning point. The reform, planned by American and British economic advisors, abolished the worthless Reichsmark and removed nearly 90% of existing cash from circulation. Each citizen received a limited initial allowance, and wages and prices were recalculated to reflect real value. This sudden stabilization broke the back of the black market almost overnight. Shelves that had been empty for years filled with goods as farmers and traders began accepting legal currency again. Yet beneath this visible recovery, remnants of the wartime shadow networks persisted. Many individuals who had profited during the Nazi era retained untraceable assets, foreign currency, gold, and property acquired through confiscation or forced sales. Some of these holdings re-entered circulation quietly, converted into investments, or used to rebuild private businesses. The economic revival of West Germany, later termed the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, owed as much to external aid and structural reform as to the reorganization of its industrial base. The Marshall Plan injected more than $1.4 billion into the Western zones between 1948 and 1952, providing machinery, raw materials, and food supplies. Yet much of this reconstruction effort also involved reclaiming or repurposing industries that had been integral to the Nazi war machine. Companies like Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, and Siemens resumed production using infrastructure that had survived bombing. While official policy promoted transparency and accountability, many enterprises quietly retained managerial staff who had served under the previous regime. The continuity of personnel ensured technical competence but also carried forward an ingrained culture of secrecy and pragmatic opportunism, traits honed in the wartime shadow economy. Meanwhile, in the Soviet occupation zone, the economic order evolved along entirely different lines. The USSR's extraction of reparations, valued at an estimated $10 billion, left the region economically crippled. Factories, machinery, and even entire production lines were dismantled and shipped east. To restore productivity, Soviet administrators established Volkseigenbetriebe, people's enterprises, nationalizing industry, and centralizing planning. Officially, this eliminated private profit and exploitation. In practice, it produced a new form of shadow economy. Shortages and inefficiencies encourage barter and unrecorded trade, especially between urban workers and rural producers. The same survival instincts cultivated during the Nazi era, concealment of goods, informal exchange, and distrust of authority, reappeared under socialism, now adapted to a planned economy. The process of tracking looted assets and financial crimes continued well into the 1950s. The Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point and Munich Central Collecting Point cataloged tens of thousands of artworks, archives, and valuables recovered from hidden depots and salt mines. Allied and later West German investigators traced stolen gold through Swiss and Portuguese banks, uncovering networks of intermediaries who had facilitated Nazi transactions during the war. The investigations revealed the extent to which neutral financial institutions had profited from laundering Reich assets. Yet, despite international efforts, a substantial portion of looted property remained unaccounted for, especially gold, securities, and industrial patents transferred through secret agreements in the final months of the war. The inability to fully recover these assets underscored the durability of the system that had sustained the Reich's economy, a structure designed to conceal and redistribute wealth beyond the reach of law. By the mid-1950s, Germany's economic landscape appeared transformed, yet traces of its hidden past lingered in subtle forms. Former SS-owned lands and enterprises had been absorbed into public ownership or privatized under new names. Some of the wealth accumulated through forced labor and expropriation was reinvested into the very industries that drove post-war recovery. The continuity of capital blurred moral accountability. Legal proceedings against corporations for wartime exploitation often ended in financial settlements rather than convictions. Reparations to survivors and victims' families, while significant, represented only a fraction of the profits generated through forced labor. The shadow economy's legacy had been partially legalized, its structures integrated into the rebuilding of a democratic economy. At the same time, West Germany's re-entry into international trade depended on suppressing certain uncomfortable truths. The export success of the 1950s rested on industries that had been pillars of the Nazi economy: steel, chemicals, and automotive production. The Reconstruction narrative emphasized efficiency and modernization, avoiding discussion of how wartime looting and exploitation had financed those same industries. Behind the language of renewal lay a form of continuity that historians would later describe as economic amnesia. The state and private sector sought stability through silence, preferring to obscure the connection between wartime profits and post-war prosperity. In East Germany, official propaganda condemned capitalist exploitation, but quietly tolerated informal exchange networks that kept society functioning. Shortages of food, clothing, and consumer goods made the Schwarzmarkt indispensable. State workers and farmers traded privately to supplement their rations, while factory managers manipulated quotas and inventories to secure scarce materials. This duplicity mirrored the dynamics of the Nazi-era economy, officially centralized, yet dependent on local, unrecorded adjustments. The continuity of survival through informal systems underscored a deeper historical pattern, that total economic control, whether fascist or socialist, inevitably generated its own clandestine counterpart. Thus, by the mid-20th century, both German states inherited a paradoxical legacy. The destruction of the Nazi regime had not eradicated the structures of its hidden economy, but dispersed them into new political and economic orders. The West absorbed them into market capitalism. The East reproduced them under central planning. In both cases, the habits of secrecy, exploitation, and adaptation, born from the moral and material collapse of the Third Reich, remained integral to the functioning of post-war society. The shadow economy that once sustained a dictatorship had become a silent inheritance of modern Europe, shaping its recovery as much as it once had its destruction. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the reconstruction of Germany was well underway, but the economic rebirth of the nation still bore the invisible marks of its past. The official narrative celebrated the Wirtschaftswunder, a triumph of labor, efficiency, and innovation. But beneath this surface lay unexamined continuities from the hidden economy of the Third Reich. The same industrial networks that had profited from forced labor now powered exports. The same banks that once laundered plundered assets now financed recovery. The transformation from dictatorship to democracy in economic terms was gradual, pragmatic, and incomplete. The shadow economy had not been destroyed. It had adapted. In West Germany, the political will to confront these continuities was limited. The Cold War reframed priorities. Anti-communism and economic stability outweighed retrospective justice. Former Nazi technocrats and economists, valued for their expertise, returned to positions of influence in ministries, corporations, and banks. Walther Funk's monetary policies, refined during the war, informed early West German fiscal reforms, while industrial leaders such as Alfred Krupp were released from prison and soon reinstated as major figures in post-war industry. The state sought reconciliation through pragmatism, retaining talent, restoring productivity, and securing Western alliances. This pragmatic continuity helped stabilize West Germany, but also ensured that many of the mechanisms of wartime enrichment remained unexamined. The corporate restitution processes revealed the scale of this continuity. Companies such as I.G. Farben, dissolved in name but reborn as BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, reintegrated into global markets, though Allied trials had identified their complicity in forced labor and resource exploitation. Post-war courts accepted financial settlements as substitutes for accountability. Krupp, AG, Mannesmann, and Flick Gruppe also compensated victims through limited payments while reclaiming assets confiscated during denazification. The practical effect was that capital accumulated through the Third Reich's hidden economy continued to circulate, rebranded under democratic legitimacy. For millions of Germans seeking stability and prosperity, this continuity was convenient. It allowed the country to move forward without reopening the moral wounds of the past. Meanwhile, in East Germany, a different version of this continuity unfolded under state socialism. The expropriation of private industry in 1946 had transferred ownership to the state, but the administrative structures often remained intact. Many factory managers and engineers who had served the Nazi war economy were retained for their technical expertise. The centralized economy, while ideologically opposed to capitalism, reproduced similar patterns of hidden exchange. Shortages led to unofficial trade, hoarding, and barter. The Buchware, goods secretly held back from official sale, became a feature of daily life. In this sense, East Germany's black market was both a symptom of inefficiency and a reflection of a cultural legacy, the learned instinct to navigate around official control. Internationally, the search for Nazi assets continued, but with diminishing momentum. The discovery of gold caches, hidden art collections, and foreign bank accounts persisted through the 1960s. Yet most investigations concluded without full restitution. Swiss banks, under pressure from both Western governments and Jewish organizations, released partial records but continued to withhold complete transparency. Many of the Reich's hidden deposits had already been converted into investments during the 1940s and 1950s, disappearing into global capital flows. The transnational dimension of the Third Reich's economy, its ties to neutral states, private intermediaries, and multinational firms, proved too complex to fully unravel. The Nazi shadow economy, once confined to occupied Europe, had dissolved into the fabric of post-war capitalism itself. Within Germany, public discussion of economic complicity was limited until the 1960s, when a new generation began to challenge the silence of their parents. Academic research, driven by historians and journalists, revealed the extent to which the wartime economy had depended on mass exploitation. Studies by West German scholars uncovered thousands of companies involved in forced labor and traced their post-war transformations. Public awareness grew, but the government's response remained cautious. Official inquiries emphasized moral regret while avoiding structural reform. Compensation funds were established for foreign laborers only decades after the war, and most payments arrived too late to reach the majority of survivors. The endurance of the shadow economy's methods was evident in the persistence of secrecy and informal dealings within post-war business culture. The use of shell companies, discreet political donations, and hidden financial channels echoed earlier practices. The Nazi regime had institutionalized corruption as a form of governance. Its successors replaced ideology with pragmatism, but maintained the same flexibility in bending economic rules. This continuity was not unique to Germany. It reflected a broader European reality. Nations across the continent rebuilt using resources and personnel shaped by wartime conditions. The reconstruction of Europe, therefore, carried with it an unspoken inheritance, the techniques of concealment and control that had sustained the total economies of the 1930s and 1940s. In East Germany, similar habits emerged under different political banners. Official reports in the 1950s documented widespread economic sabotage, a term used to describe employees diverting goods or manipulating quotas to survive within a system of scarcity. Though condemned by the state, these practices became part of everyday adaptation. The state's response, tightening surveillance and increasing bureaucratic oversight, only deepened the gap between official economy and lived reality. Thus, both German states, divided by ideology, shared a common structural inheritance. Each relied on informal systems to maintain functionality within rigid frameworks of control. By the end of the 1960s, the visible remnants of the Nazi economy had largely vanished, replaced by modern institutions and democratic governance. Yet the psychological and structural legacies of the shadow economy remained embedded in the foundations of both German republics. The lessons of exploitation and concealment had shaped post-war reconstruction, defining attitudes towards secrecy, authority, and economic pragmatism. Germany's recovery was genuine, but it was built upon layers of unacknowledged continuity, where the boundaries between moral accountability and economic necessity blurred into the fabric of modern prosperity. The hidden economy of the Third Reich had ceased to exist as an institution, but its logic, the fusion of bureaucracy, secrecy, and opportunism, remained a quiet undercurrent within the new European order. The shadow economy of the Third Reich left a legacy far beyond the war it had helped sustain. It shaped not only the immediate post-war recovery of Germany, but also the moral, institutional, and cultural frameworks that define Europe's modern economies. What had begun as a hidden system of exploitation, concealing the true costs of militarization and genocide, became a historical template for understanding how secrecy and coercion can coexist with industrial progress. Its destruction in 1945 did not mark a clean rupture. Rather, it revealed the extent to which moral compromise and bureaucratic rationality could intertwine in an advanced modern state. The exposure of the Reich's financial apparatus during the Nuremberg trials was a watershed moment. Prosecutors documented how ministries, corporations, and banks had coordinated the plunder of occupied Europe and the enslavement of millions. Yet, even as these revelations shocked the world, the complexity of the system defied simple accountability. The Nazi economy had operated through diffuse networks, private firms, SS offices, local administrators, and neutral intermediaries, each insulated by bureaucratic compartmentalization. This diffusion made collective responsibility difficult to establish. The trials convicted individuals, but left the economic architecture largely intact, setting a precedent for selective justice in the face of structural crime. In the decades that followed, Germany's rapid economic resurgence was accompanied by a gradual process of moral reckoning. The 1960s generation, confronting the silence of their elders, demanded a re-examination of corporate complicity and state collaboration. Academic research began to map the economic geography of exploitation. Factories built near concentration camps, rail lines constructed by forced labor, financial institutions that managed looted assets. The publication of company archives, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, revealed detailed records of transactions once considered lost. These disclosures reshaped public understanding of the war, demonstrating that industrial efficiency and mass atrocity were not opposing forces, but elements of a single economic system. The late 20th century brought new forms of restitution and reflection. German corporations established compensation funds for surviving forced laborers, while museums and scholars worked to trace looted art and cultural property. The financial settlements reached in the 2000s, though significant, could never fully account for the magnitude of economic exploitation that had sustained the Reich. Yet the process itself marked an evolution, an acknowledgement that the hidden economy of the Third Reich had been as central to its power as its armies or propaganda. The reckoning also forced democratic Germany to confront the uncomfortable continuity between its pre-war, wartime, and post-war industries, compelling a new ethic of corporate transparency that remains influential in modern German economic policy. Beyond Germany, the shadow economy of the Reich became a case study for understanding the intersection of authoritarianism and capitalism. It demonstrated how totalitarian systems could maintain an illusion of economic order while operating through corruption, coercion, and expropriation. Scholars have since drawn parallels between the Nazi model and other regimes that fused ideology with opportunism, using informal economies to sustain centralized control. The lesson that emerged was not merely historical, but structural, that every command economy generates its own informal counterpart, and every hidden system of profit leaves behind moral debts that outlast material ones. In the broader context of European recovery, the legacy of the Nazi economic system also influenced international institutions. The post-war creation of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reflected a determination to establish mechanisms of transparency, stability, and accountability that would prevent a recurrence of hidden financial empires. The European Coal and Steel Community, the forerunner of the European Union, was explicitly designed to integrate resources that had once fueled total war into a framework of shared oversight. In this sense, the reconstruction of Europe was also the dismantling of the material conditions that had enabled the Third Reich's shadow economy to thrive. Today, the study of the Nazi economic system continues to evolve beyond the boundaries of wartime history. Economists and historians examine it as a warning about the fragility of legality under conditions of fear, ideology, and concentration of power. The archives of companies, ministries, and financial institutions reveal not only the crimes of individuals, but the mechanisms through which modern economies can conceal exploitation behind bureaucratic normality. The Nazi economy thus remains a mirror, reflecting the capacity of advanced societies to rationalize injustice when efficiency and loyalty become higher values than accountability and ethics. In the end, the shadow economy of the Third Reich was not an aberration of history, but a manifestation of its age, an industrial civilization that transformed moral collapse into administrative process. It demonstrated that secrecy can become a governing principle, that profit can mask violence, and that bureaucracy can outlive ideology. Its ruins, economic, ethical, and human, formed the foundation upon which modern Europe rebuilt itself. The legacy it left behind is not measured only in lost lives or stolen wealth, but in the enduring reminder that prosperity, when detached from conscience, can conceal the darkest forms of destruction beneath the appearance of progress.